Daddy, why? Cried little Jaeger as his foster father packed his belongings. The man was so merciless that it baffled the boy. He had considered him his father, loved him as his own, and yet. At least for the sake of Mom's memory, don't do this, the boy continued to plead. She loved both of us so much, she would never forgive you for betraying me. But Constantine was unyielding. He had absolutely no desire to raise a 10-year-old boy who wasn't his own. Nor had he wanted to adopt a child in the first place, but he couldn't say no to his wife. Vera meant everything to him, and now that she was gone, he didn't need the son. Why do you get so upset? The man would ask each time his wife brought up the topic of children. She was younger than him but had already turned 40 and was deeply troubled by her inability to become a mother. You wouldn't understand, Vera would sigh sadly. You've only ever cared about your career. Work, business. You couldn't care less about children. But I'm a woman and can't live like this anymore. You understand, I want a baby. Women my age are already taking their kids to school, and I. These discussions went on for a whole year, thoroughly exhausting Constantine. His wife had mentioned children before, but it had never been such an obsessive idea. He knew that sooner or later, this issue would have to be resolved, otherwise Vera would make life miserable for both of them. He was indifferent to fatherhood. If they had children, fine, if not, then so be it. Why not live and be happy with such a husband? But Vera dreamed of something entirely different. Desperate, she consulted every doctor and specialist she could find. When all her efforts led nowhere, Vera decided to have a serious talk with her husband. Of course not, I'm categorically against it, Constantine replied when his wife asked how he felt about adopting a child. Why can't you just live peacefully? Find something to do. I have so much money, and you have opportunities. I've never denied you anything, never restricted you. Open a beauty salon or something, whatever it is women in our circle do. Why do you need children? Vera could never understand how her husband could be so indifferent to offspring. All his business partners had long had children, and it seemed he had no desire to take his own son by the hand, to go to the cinema or a cafe on weekends. Vera found this strange. When she married Constantine, she was sure they would have a large family. She dreamed of their home always being filled with children's laughter, but her idea of a happy family life shattered against harsh reality. Despite this, she continued to convince her husband that they absolutely needed a child. All right, enough, Constantine said one day, tired of his wife's daily whining. We'll go to an orphanage tomorrow. Just so, if it's turned out that we haven't been given our own children from above, let's adopt someone not too young, at least 5 years old. I have a serious business, and I can't constantly deal with a headache from a child's crying. I agree to adoption, but only under this condition. This was one of the reasons Constantine never regretted not having children. From acquaintances and partners, he had heard enough stories about how hard it was to fall asleep at 3 in the morning and then get up for work at 6. When children are small, it's just how it is. And Constantine didn't want any of that. Not to mention moving out to live separately from the family while the child was young. This thought occasionally crossed his mind when he considered that they might still have children. Now, however, the question was moot, and he had no desire to create extra inconveniences for himself. Vera, of course, wanted a baby but was forced to agree with her husband. You talk as if we're adopting an inanimate object, buying a product from a store, the woman protested. All right, as you say, so it shall be. In the end, you're willing to compromise, and I, in my turn, am also ready to make certain concessions. How good it is that we understand each other and have agreed on everything. Constantine smiled, secretly hoping that his wife's zeal for motherhood would be satisfied with one child and that in the future she would not insist on adopting 2 or 3 more. The visit to the orphanage deeply moved Vera. She had never experienced such strong emotions before. She herself had nearly become an orphan at just 11 years old. But, fortunately, after the tragic death of her mother, who had been raising Vera alone, her grandmother took her under her wing. It was barely within the woman's power to raise Vera, but the worst was avoided, and that was what mattered most. She remembered this even on her deathbed, praying for her only granddaughter's life to turn out well and happy. Upon arriving at the orphanage, Vera somehow remembered her grandmother and nearly burst into tears. Normally, she allowed herself to delve into the past only when she was alone. But then, suddenly overwhelmed, Constantine had to calm his wife. "Please calm down," the man whispered in her ear when he saw that Vera was barely holding back her tears. "After all, we came here with a certain purpose. I have very little time. Why don't you choose someone? I'll talk to the director about adoption, and we'll go home. I have 2 important meetings today, my whole day is scheduled by the minute." As always, Constantine was strict and stern, but his words did not affect his wife's state, who was still confused and struggling to contain her emotions. Vera only came to her senses after a little boy, about 5 or 6 years old, tugged at her. Vera hadn't even noticed how he approached her. So absorbed was she in her thoughts. "Are you my mom?" the little boy asked, looking into Vera's eyes. Confused, the woman didn't know what to answer. Vera was so shocked that she couldn't find the right words. She looked at the boy, whose eyes were filled with hope, understanding only one thing: she couldn't deceive them. A few minutes later, a caretaker scolded Jaeger. "How are you behaving?" the woman asked sternly. "Don't bother people. Come on. It's time for lunch." "No, wait," Vera exclaimed, as if struck by lightning. Squatting down next to the little boy, she looked into his eyes and nodded affirmatively. "Yes, Bunny, I am your mom," she said. "Let's go home." At that moment, Constantine was ready to sink into the ground with shame while they waited for the director, who that day arrived at work later than usual. The man was not lecturing or moralizing. "Vera, you're an adult," Constantine grumbled discontentedly. "But how are you behaving? I'm at a loss for words, but do I really need to explain that this is not okay? What did I do?" Vera was surprised, her husband's words deeply hurt her. "What did I say? How do you not understand that you can't show preference to one child in front of the others?" hissed her husband. "It's unseemly. But if I've decided to adopt this boy, why should I hide it?" the woman protested. Their conversation was interrupted by a man approaching the office, holding a suitcase and a thick folder with some papers. "Are you here to see me?" he asked. "Sorry to have kept you waiting, but you know how it is with traffic. Barely made it. Please, come in." The out-of-breath director took off his coat and sat down at his desk. Cautious and fearful Constantine immediately bombarded him with questions. The man wanted to thoroughly investigate Jaeger's background before agreeing to adopt him. Vera was shocked by her husband's behavior. She was sure they had made a decision and that her husband supported her. Only when they left the director's office did she realize that Constantine would not have agreed to the adoption if Jaeger had been the son of unfortunate and antisocial parents. "The boy is wonderful," the director praised Jaeger, sensing a chance to get rid of an extra mouth to feed. The orphanage's funding was not great, and every child placed in a family was a real celebration for the institution. Only, he hadn't been lucky. His parents died when Jaeger was just a year old. A decent, good family, they loved their son very much. And the grandmother was very old, probably not even alive anymore. So, the boy ended up with us. The child is very kind, sincerely responsive, and clever. You won't regret it if you decide to take him in." A month later, when all the necessary documents were prepared, Jaeger moved to his new family. Vera was so happy. She adored the boy beyond measure. She enrolled him in the best kindergarten, constantly took him out for walks and to various events. At some point, Vera even began to think that Constantine had also grown to love their foster son. Sometimes, when the man had some free time, he spent it with his family. Jaeger considered Constantine his dad and respected and loved him very much. It seemed that the boy had nothing more to worry about. All his suffering was behind him. Jaeger had a loving mom and a father who had come to terms with the family matters. But 5 years later, everything changed dramatically. When Vera heard the terrible diagnosis from the doctors, she hoped that she would somehow pull through. Constantine, as best as he could, comforted his wife and leveraged all his connections to pull her back from the brink. He arranged for Vera to be treated by the best oncologist, sparing no expense. But this was not a case where finances could solve everything. The disease was detected too late, when nothing more could be done. Vera rarely went for checkups. After the doctors failed to help her achieve her long-awaited happiness of motherhood, she stopped trusting them. And so, she missed the critical time. If only you had come a month or two earlier, perhaps something could have been done, sighed the doctor. But unfortunately, it was now too late. Vera was fading away right before everyone's eyes. With each day, she got worse and worse, her heart breaking with pain, not for herself, but for her son. Although she had made Constantine promise not to abandon Jaeger to fate, she wasn't sure he would keep it. In the last few weeks of Vera's life, it seemed as though the man had forgotten about the boy altogether. He hired the first nanny he could find, who took him to school and helped with his homework. He himself spent all day in the hospital, by his dying wife's bedside. Vera wanted to stay home until the very last day of her life, but eventually decided to follow the doctor's advice. The pains were so severe and unbearable that the visiting nurse, who came once a day, could hardly alleviate Vera's suffering. She needed constant medical support to stay conscious and live out her last days without terrible physical suffering. Vera spent her final hours in complete solitude. She passed away deep in the night when everyone else was asleep. In the morning, Constantine was awakened by the expected phone call. The day before, the doctor had informed him that his wife's time had run out and it would be better if he spent that night at home. Let her be alone. There's nothing worse than dying and realizing that you'll never see your closest person again. Trust me. The doctor's words were so convincing that Constantine heeded them. After saying goodbye to his wife, he left the ward and went home. Both he and she knew it was forever. Vera had a premonition that she would not wake up the next day. For the first few months after his wife's death, Constantine didn't even think about sending Jaeger to an orphanage. After all, he had given her his word and had to keep it. But as time passed, the man became increasingly convinced that the foster son was too much of a burden for him. While Vera had previously taken care of all matters related to him, now Constantine had to do it himself, which took a lot of time and effort. Something had to be done, and this restlessness did not give Constantine peace until he finally accepted the harsh reality as it was. I don't need this boy, he told himself. And it's high time I admitted it to myself. I can't handle it, and hiring nannies and tutors, what's the difference between living with me and being in an orphanage? Jaeger can be raised by strangers there too, and frankly, I don't see him as my future heir. So why lie to myself and force myself to do something I absolutely don't want? Before telling his son about his decision, Constantine visited his wife's grave and asked for her forgiveness. Vera, please understand me correctly, he whispered, looking at the photograph on the tombstone. I can't live like this, I just can't. I hope you'll forgive me, and even if you don't, well, what does it matter? On that last night Jaeger spent in his foster father's house, Constantine was visited in his dream by his wife. She appeared real, only the light emanating from her reminded him that Vera was dead. Even in the dream, he understood this, so he didn't take her words seriously at all. You will regret this, Vera said, and her clear voice spread through the room like a melody. And there will come a day when the sun will extend a helping hand to you, you will be at the very bottom of your life, and only then will you realize the terrible mistake you made. But by then, it will be impossible to correct it. Waking up, Constantine packed his son's belongings and drove him back to the same orphanage from which he and his wife had once taken him. If it's not a secret. What happened? Asked the director, who was surprised that such a well-off person was bringing a child back to the orphanage. Usually, children were returned due to financial difficulties, but this clearly wasn't the case here. My wife died a few months ago, Constantine said, calmly. We took the boy for her. I was initially against it, and now I'm left alone. That's how it turned out. He didn't intend to justify himself to anyone, it was his decision, and he had every right to it. The director's opinion, who looked at Constantine with eyes wide open in shock, didn't interest him at the moment. The man could not have imagined that many years later, he would remember both that look and his wife's prophetic words. Only, it happened when it was indeed too late to change anything. Constantine could never have imagined that years later, his business would fail, and partners who had always seemed so loyal and devoted would turn out to be traitors. And it was a good thing he didn't end up in prison, as everything was heading precisely in that direction. At first, the man didn't even understand where the trouble was coming from. Constantine was confident that any day he would finish all work projects and finally be able to rest. In his old age, he planned to live off dividends. After all, he had worked his whole life for his own benefit. But all his plans collapsed in an instant. Those scoundrels left me almost without pants, he exclaimed. He barely managed to scrape together enough for this shack, giving away his last money. The man sat in a dilapidated one-room apartment on the very outskirts of the city and nearly cried out of frustration. Comfortable living conditions were something he had to forget about forever. Now, he was an ordinary mortal, forced to toil day in and day out just to survive. And he would have been glad to work, but no one would hire him. Over the last few weeks, he had attended more than 10 interviews and everywhere received the same response. Work as a loader at your age? You must be joking. Employers almost laughed in his face. Out of desperation and pennilessness, the man was ready to beg. But luck finally found him. With great difficulty, Constantine managed to get a job at one of the automotive companies. The salary was laughably small, but it was something. At that moment, he was grateful for it. In the situation he found himself in, there was no room for choice. Signing the contract, the man noticed the initials of the general director. Mr. Yeager. This can't be a coincidence, he thought to himself. Or maybe it could. How he wished to see him, to assure himself that his assumption was nonsense, but who would arrange a meeting with the general director for a mere loader? It wasn't even worth mentioning, it would be too costly for him. But memories of his foster son wouldn't leave him alone. Constantine understood that Yeager had long since grown up. It was quite possible that he had been adopted by a good family, or maybe not, and had remained in the orphanage. Ah, he sighed, sitting in his modest kitchen in the evenings, sipping hot tea from a cup. If I still had my own security service like before, I would have definitely found out everything. But now? The meeting with his son happened spontaneously, and it was so unexpected that Constantine was initially taken aback. Normally, the man never dined in the local canteen, it was beyond his means, but that day he was very hungry and decided he could afford it once a month. At the next table, a young man in a business suit was sipping coffee and working on his laptop. Constantine's gaze immediately stopped on him. The man stood out from the other canteen visitors by his appearance. Managers and other employees wore casual clothes to work, a business style was not adopted in the company. Constantine immediately guessed that only the general director could dress like that. How he has grown, how he has changed, he thought, catching himself on the thought that he would never have recognized in this young man the little Yeager he had seen for the last time many years ago. But the young man immediately recognized his foster father. He hadn't changed much over the years, only now he looked downtrodden and worn out. Unsurprisingly, it was not easy for Constantine to endure his downfall. The man was lost and completely clueless about how to continue living, drifting aimlessly without seeing any future prospects. I'm too old to start all over again, he told himself. I can't expect anything good from life anymore. Constantine couldn't have been more wrong. He didn't anticipate that, after so many years, his son would forgive him for what he had done. What's done is done, sighed Yeager, after having a heartfelt conversation with his father. The past can't be brought back. Perhaps everything that happened was for a reason. I've learned a lot over the years, and this experience has helped me become who I am. Life in the orphanage was never easy. Jaeger had to fight for his place under the sun multiple times. While the atmosphere among the younger children was never as fierce, the older ones were ready to tear each other apart for an extra crust of bread. But Jaeger wasn't broken. He knew that these gloomy days spent within the orphanage's walls would end someday, and he would step into an independent adult life. Here too, everyone was for themselves, but intelligence, tenacity, and talent played leading roles. Jaeger was always clever and wise. He managed to get into and successfully graduate from college on his own, and he founded a small company. Gradually, he climbed higher, never forgetting his foster parents, especially his mother. He regularly visited her grave to share his successes, joys, sorrows, and minor life troubles. How he regretted that she didn't live to see this day. Perhaps if his mother hadn't died, his life would have turned out completely differently. Sooner or later, we would have met anyway, father, said Jaeger. Even if life hadn't brought you down to rock bottom and you hadn't ended up working in my company, there would have come a day when we would have visited Mom together. Our meeting was inevitable. Constantine couldn't imagine that he remembered them. How guilty he felt towards them. He had never experienced such a deep sense of guilt in his life. Let's go home, the son suggested. I don't think you want to go back to your shack, and I have a large apartment with plenty of room for you. How right he was. He had read his thoughts exactly. The mere sight of his new dwelling made Constantine shudder. He hated that miserable apartment with all his heart, dreading the thought that he would have to live there for the rest of his days. But, as it turned out, these fears were completely unfounded. Jaeger didn't allow his father to languish in poverty. You'll help me. You have a lot of business experience, and as they say, you can't drink that away, it doesn't just disappear. And rent out your shack, why should it just sit there unused? How grateful and happy Constantine was for Jaeger's kind and sensitive heart. And indeed, Vera was right to choose him back then in the orphanage. He thought to himself. She must have seen what a good boy he was, if only she were alive now. Visiting his wife's grave, Constantine cried and repented. You were right, my Vera, right, he whispered. And I didn't listen to you then, as if you hadn't come to me in a dream and warned me. Oh, what a fool I was, it's scary to remember. How guilty I am to you. If you can, forgive me. That night, she came to him in a dream again, but she didn't say a word. Constantine wanted to hug her tightly, but Vera slipped away like a shadow, and he woke up and continued living his normal life. Only now, it was again filled with meaning, which he had lost through his own folly but regained by a fortunate twist of fate. To fate.